5 Live Formula One.
We have a bumper podcast for you today with a sprint race and qualifying to discuss, and a dominant Saturday for Max Verstappen, taking his 40th pole position and winning what he described as a spicy sprint race. Ben Edwards and Mark Priestley watched events unfold. We'll discuss the sprint in a moment, but we have to start with qualifying. And Max was a country mile ahead of everyone else, Ben.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because often the time differences here in Austria are tiny because it's not a long lap in terms of lap time, but he actually had a decent margin throughout the whole of qualifying. Actually, it wasn't just like one run, he kept doing it, and we were quite surprised in the end at the gap he had. And Lando Norris came second again, so as it was in the sprint race grid, which we, as you say, we'll talk about the sprint race later, but Max Verstappen was in tremendous form. And it's interesting also, I think, this format of sprint, the way it is now, that they can modify the cars after the sprint race, ready for qualifying. It looked like Red Bull actually probably made some better modifications than the other teams. And Max, who has dominated here at the Red Bull Ring. I mean, I remember coming to the Red Bull Ring when it was first the Red Bull Ring, and Red Bull actually didn't perform terribly well. But in the recent years, it has just been Max dominating this place, and it's just carrying on so far.
Yes, so Max Verstappen is on pole position. He'll be alongside Lando Norris. Then it's Russell for Mercedes and Sainz for Ferrari. So that's nice. Top four different teams. Then it's Hamilton, Leclerc, Piastri, Perez, Hülkenberg and Ocon as the top 10. We'll just run through the rest. It's Ricciardo, Magnussen, Gasly, Tsunoda, Alonso, Albon, Stroll, Bottas, Sargent and Zhou. As it stands, there are some people going up to the steward's office. We will find out if there's any penalties to come, Hülkenberg. But, Mark, were you surprised that it didn't feel going into that Verstappen would have as big a lead as he did? And then all of a sudden, wow.
I'm absolutely gobsmacked at the gap that he managed to pull out, 0.4 around a lap time that is, just over a minute long. I mean, that is unbelievable. And I know that we've seen Max Verstappen dominance for a long period of time. And, if you're a Formula One fan and you've kind of had enough of it, I get all of that. But sometimes you just have to take your hat off and say, that was pretty special. He nailed everything. He just got it absolutely right, as did the team, as they so often do. And even a Lando Norris, who's really on form right now in a McLaren that's performing really, really well. Even Lando said at the end of it, there was just nothing more that I could do. I think the third sector was possibly where Lando Norris left a little bit out on the table. Tiny little bit of a mistake, but nothing really. And actually, I think we've just got to say that was something very special from Max today.
And it was beautifully driven because it didn't actually look overly dramatic. It was just fast. I mean, he was very smooth with it. He wasn't busy correcting it everywhere. He just kept it absolutely on the limit, but perfectly done without running wide, clipping apexes pretty much throughout. It was beautifully done, as you say. Very, very impressive to watch.
Yeah, and if you were ever going to throw a criticism at Max Verstappen, and you could always say that in recent times over the last couple of years, they've not had much of a challenge really outside of their own team, have they? So he hasn't been put under huge pressure in moments like this. Well, now he is under pressure. Now he's got definitely Lando Norris, but also others, the likes of George Russell in the Mercedes, at times Ferraris. They're all nipping at his heels. They're putting him under pressure, and still he manages to deliver.
And to have almost 9/10 over his own teammate, Sergio Perez. I mean, around a lap like this, which is such a short lap in terms of timing, nearly 9/10 over Perez. That's a huge margin. Makes you wonder again, Perez, is he really delivering for Red Bull? Or is the car just now perfectly set up for Max? He loves a particular feel, which doesn't always suit Perez. And I wonder if they've sort of taken it further down that route that really suits Max. As you say, he looks so comfortable out there today.
Well, I think there is an argument that the direction the car has gone in terms of development certainly suits Max. And why wouldn't they? They are his biggest asset. But I don't think it can be just that. I think there's a large part of this now, and even more so after today, there's going to be psychological, isn't it? It's going to be confidence-based. We know in any sport, if you're a top sports person, you need to be confident in what you're doing. You've got to have your headspace in exactly the right zone. And I'm afraid to say that with results over recent times, Sergio just isn't there right now.
At least he got in the top 10. He hasn't been in the top 10 for quite a few races, actually.
Well, there's a positive, yeah.
He's getting there. Let's hear from our pole position man. It is Max Verstappen.
Hey Max, that felt like one of the all-time great qualified laps. Massive gap. Looked like you had an inch perfect. You must be delighted.
Yeah, it's been good. The whole qualifying was very nice. The car was really hooked up after the changes that we made, after sprint qualifying, or the sprint race, sorry. And it was very nice. I didn't expect that, but of course I'm very pleased with it.
How much confidence did that give you tomorrow? Because obviously it was tighter with McLaren's in the sprint this morning. Does it feel like you've got a bit of a gap on them now?
Yeah, I'm confident, but of course, we have to wait and see what is going to happen tomorrow. The last few races, I felt like we were lacking a little bit in the race. This morning, I think was already quite positive, and hopefully with the things that we change on the car, it will support that even more.
Great stuff. Good luck. Thanks.
Alongside him, it's getting to be a regular thing, isn't it? It'll be Lando Norris. Does it matter that he was so far behind Max Verstappen?
Well, it'll matter to Lando. We know how hard Lando's pushing himself right now, and he's often very, very critical of himself. We saw that in the sprint. He's been very critical of himself in that race. But I think in qualifying, all you can do at the end of a day like today is draw a line under it and say, look, I'm on the front row. It's another day tomorrow. It's a Grand Prix. And we know that the McLaren tends to come alive in a Grand Prix. We know that it looks after its tyres well, and its race pace is typically very good. So he's got to draw a line under today and say, look, he didn't have anything in terms of what Max had over the one lap. But we've seen it in recent races that he is able to put a challenge when it comes to Sunday. So he'll now be focusing on that and hoping that he can deliver something special there.
Absolutely. And I think there is every chance he can do that. He wasn't feeling 100% today, and you wonder if that maybe just cost him a little bit in qualifying. Hopefully he's going to feel in good form tomorrow. And there were opportunities in the sprint race, and he can really rethink through all of that tonight and just try and work out what could work. The start that Verstappen made earlier was very impressive, but I do think that Lando Norris, he's in that mix. As we were talking earlier about the fact that he's now chasing race wins. He's not just there for podiums anymore, and I feel that is a major part of him now.
Let's hear from him.
Hey, Orlando. Another front row start for tomorrow's race. How are you feeling about how qualifying went? I know the gap to Max was quite big, but were you pleased with your efforts?
Yeah, I don't think it was some of my best laps, but still P2, so I can answer for a lot more. But clearly, from the beginning of qualifying, Max was a big chunk ahead of everyone. Even his lap on the used at the beginning was better than my lap on the new. So, I think as McLaren, we've always done a very good job at just kind of turning up to races and doing a good job straight away. The setup's 99% of the way there as soon as we arrive at the track. It seems like they didn't, and they didn't optimize yesterday at all in their setup. And when they made a few tweaks in today, they've been able to just unlock a lot more potential than what we were able to. So, one, that means we did a good job yesterday. Two, that means that they're much quicker than we are. So, I think second I'm happy with, and tomorrow in the race, even a second at the minute is probably going to be looking good, but I'll do my best to push and see what I can do ahead.
From what you learned when you crunched the data for the long run today in the sprint, and from what you've seen from Red Bull's improvement, is it going to be a bit too tricky, do you think, to take the fight to Max?
Obviously this morning was with yesterday's setup, and when they've changed a few things and tried to improve, they made a big step forward. So especially with such a good gap, even if the gap halves tomorrow, he's still 0.2 a lap quicker, and that's a lot. That's a big chunk. So I'll do my best. I'll see what we can do, but not too convinced we're going to have the pace to keep up.
Good luck, thanks.
So as you said, he wasn't feeling particularly well today. My worry is that he will get inside his own head. And as a driver, he's very critical on himself. And having a whole night to sit there and ponder, how do I do this? How do I start? How will I approach it? How will I go up that hill? How will I get into turn 3 and turn 4? And you can just feel your own mind trying to unravel.
Yeah, he can be an overthinker at times. But look, one thing that these sprint weekends give you is 2 opportunities at going through the motions of a race. So,
that makes it even worse.
Well, it can be. It does depend how you approach it. You're absolutely right. If he's up all night not sleeping and he's thinking about the sort of failures of days gone by, absolutely. Or he can look at what didn't go quite perfectly and he can start to work out little tiny ways that he might be able to improve it. That will come down to the start. We saw a Max Verstappen start in the sprint, which was definitely better. We've seen Lando struggle in the start of the Spanish Grand Prix, which potentially even cost him a win. So that'll be definitely a focus for tomorrow.
I agree with that. Yes, I think he's going to be really thinking about starts, how he can get off the line really effectively. And I don't think he's going to... I know that he thinks about himself a lot, but I do feel he's also got that confidence, that inner confidence that he can deliver. And okay, while, he knows that things could have gone a little bit better today in various different forms. I do feel that he has that confidence and the skill, the ability within him to learn and to progress. And I've loved watching that progress that he's been making in recent times.
Well, we thought he was going to be alongside his teammate Oscar Piastri, who qualified P3, but actually got his lap time deleted, so I'll start P7. And that's a shame for McLaren, isn't it?
It really is, for a number of reasons. Obviously disappointing anyway for Piastri, and off the back of a couple of slightly disappointing results for Piastri. So from a confidence perspective, that'll hurt. Also in the race, of course, McLaren will not have two cars right up the front, which can be such a strength. We know that Red Bull have only got one in the hands of Max. If they could have had two cars there, just opened up a few extra strategy options. But also in the bigger picture of this, and let's not forget that Verstappen and Red Bull have been dominant for so long. McLaren are now joining that party at the front, and we're all being impatient. We want it to happen now. We want the races to be so close. It sometimes does just take time. McLaren need to just edge towards it. They're getting there, and these results will come, and perhaps the tables will turn, and we're seeing the start of that.
I totally agree. And Oscar Piastri was unlucky because he only fractionally went over the white line. I mean, it was such a close thing. That's why he lost his fastest lap time, because it was slightly over the white line. But I tell you, it was a tiny amount. And I feel sorry for him, really, because actually he's been driving really well all weekend. We saw him perform brilliantly in the sprint race as well. So I'm a bit disappointed that he's lost that time. He's not, as you say, part of the team game to attack Max, because that could have made it even more interesting. I think he still will fight his way, but it's going to be harder from that position on the grid for Oscar.
P3 will be George Russell. Good development from them. They are coming on. Are they there yet? Or is this just...
They're not quite there yet, but in terms of their starting position, if you think about where they were just a few months ago, this is a giant leap forward. And I think that what's really important for Mercedes is that the performance they're unlocking now is almost the beginning of a new development journey. They've actually been struggling on which direction to go. They now feel like they know the direction they've got to go. So there's actually a path in front of them to unlock more performance. So I think this might be the beginning of some better times coming for Mercedes, but great for George to be on P3.
Yeah, and it was also interesting to hear from him that he also felt that they'd made a bit of a change to the car that would suit the race, and yet it also helped him in qualifying. He was a bit surprised, I think, that it worked so well in qualifying when they'd made a change that would definitely make it good for the race. And that's good to hear, because it does mean that potentially in that race tomorrow that he will have good race pace throughout the whole Grand Prix.
And he's got Hamilton really close behind him. He'll start P5. And they're actually the closest duo in the top. So will that help?
It's a difficult one to say. When they're not second and third, which is kind of what you need each other to battle for the win. I think when they're in that position, third and fifth, they'll be more fighting for their own positions. But who knows? I mean, if things change towards later in the race, if Hamilton, for example, gets past Sainz early on, and then both of them manage to gain another place through other reasons, then yes, possibly they might be able to help each other.
Well, let's hear from George Russell.
Hey George,
Hello.
cracking lap to get P3. Are you pleased with that?
Yeah, I was pleased with it. It was a challenging lap because, on two occasions I just saw dust in the distance, and I came around the corner and there was gravel everywhere. Bugger, this is going to cost me half a tenth or a tenth. Then I approached the last two quarters, gravel on the track again. I'm like, what's going on here? And when I crossed the line, it was P4 initially. I was a little bit frustrated because I felt there was more on the table. But P3 is a very fair result, a very good result. 3 races in a row now that we've been P3 with Lewis last week, in the top 3, sorry. So, yeah, it's exciting.
Feels like you've got the edge on Ferrari this weekend, and with only a Red Bull and a McLaren ahead of you, can you hold on to that podium? Do you think there's a real fight there?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 3 races in a row now that we've been ahead of Ferrari, 3 very different circuits, and that really bodes well for us, but it's so tight out there. It was half a tenth this morning between us. We were maybe 1 tenth quicker in the race, but it can very easily swing. But I think the setup changes we made from this morning will help our race pace, so I'm pretty happy about that.
Great stuff.
Thank you.
He makes me feel quite excited.
Yeah.
They've settled more for the race pace, given a bit up in quali, yet they've still managed to qualify P3.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, look, that anything can happen in the race. And although this is often a circuit that's not the easiest to overtake on, it's definitely not impossible. We saw in the sprint that the positions changed. There's a very long DRS run along that main straight. So the drag and DRS can play a huge role. The powerful effect of DRS around this track is big. So you can use that to good effect to move up the order. So I don't think this is a set. This is not going to be a procession that's going to finish in the order that it starts.
And it's also a 2-stop normally, which means that they'll have to come in, do 2 pit stops, change the tyres, which always gives an element for jeopardy.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. And we could see some changes as we go through the race, and getting the timing of your pit stop in the right time. Also, quick pit stops are always a really important thing. But of course, we know that Red Bull are one of the top ones for that. We've seen that throughout the course of the year. I do think George's confidence that they may be able to continue this run of podiums. They've had a podium, each of them, in the last 2 races. He's had one, Lewis has had one. There is a chance that they can get another one. And I just think that's building a bit of confidence within the team. This is the sort of results they need to be getting. Whether he can actually challenge for the win, that's a bit more of a question. But getting another podium would be a big boost. He's never had a podium here in Austria, so that's got to be a good target for him.
Anyone else spike your interest in qualifying that you want to mention?
Only in a disappointing sense, unfortunately. I think.
No, bring it down.
Well, I know. I'm sorry about that. I think Lewis Hamilton is in P5. I think we sort of hoped, we've seen glimpses during the weekend of real performance from the Mercedes. In free practice 1 at the beginning of the weekend, Hamilton was the pace setter. And with his teammate up in P3, I think Hamilton probably could have done better. Sergio Perez seems to be ongoing disappointment, unfortunately, for him and for the team. And obviously really disappointed about Piastri with that, overstepping the line as we talked about.
Yeah, and also Charles Leclerc, who went off. He was actually on a good lap, but then he made a little error in one corner, and then he went completely off on another. It's quite rare, actually. Charles is a great qualifier. I've always rated him as one of the top qualifiers, but today he just got a bit too carried away, and he wasn't able to attack, and so that's partly why Sainz has ended up faster than him, who hasn't been for a little while. The early part of the year, Sainz was qualifying really well. More recently, it's been Leclerc. Today, Leclerc made a little error, and that's dropped him down a touch.
Tell you, it looked like he was riding a bucking bronco. It was very surreal as he bumped across the gravel. Hamilton, he did an unsafe release. They still had some equipment marked attached to the back of the car when he went out, and it has been pulled up by the stewards.
Yeah, we're yet to see the results of that, but effectively he drove out of the garage with the exhaust extraction system still attached to the back of the car, and that dragged with it the rear jack, and it was all a bit of a mess. It all detached itself before he actually got out into the pit lane, but I think it will trigger, as you say, it triggers an unsafe release, reporting to the stewards. So we'll see how that one goes. I just want to, with all that downer that I just brought, with all the negativity and the disappointment, I want to bring one positive. Esteban Ocon. I think that's a good result. He got himself into the top 10, and the reason I say it's a good result, if you think about Alpine at the beginning of this year, and actually even just a couple of races ago, they were they were slowest team on the grid, and yet now they're consistently getting into the midfield pack. So to get into the top 10, good result.
Yeah, just to pick up on what you said about Piastri as well, for that track limits, Andrea Stella, who's the team principal, has gone to the FAA to seek some clarification about exactly why that time was deleted. And we've looked back at the replays. It's very marginal, so marginal. And it cost him P3 in the start of the race. They will be trying to get him reinstated. Whether that comes to anything is another matter.
It's like VAR, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
It did look very, very close. If you look at the sort of freeze frames from the TV footage, it's mighty close. You can see why McLaren might want to go and get some clarification, because there are certain freeze frames and screen grabs that you can see floating around the internet that say maybe he wasn't quite over the line. We'll see.
Yeah, but you have to have such an accurate picture of it. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they get anywhere with that. At the moment, though, Piastri has dropped down the order as a result.
And not very good for Aston Martin either, by the way.
No.
Qualified Alonso qualifying P15 and Stroll 17th.
That was pretty disappointing, I have to say. They really have not gone well here all weekend. And Alonso, we heard him on the radio a couple of times. He just didn't feel like he's in his normal zone, And whether that's because the car's just not giving him the feedback he needs. It feels a bit like that to me. He's just not in that zone that we know he can be. Lance Stroll, who has out-qualified Fernando a couple of times, but he wasn't comfortable either. It just looks to me as though the car was not set up well for this track.
Okay, so that's qualifying done. Coming up next, we'll look back at the sprint race.
5 Live Formula One.
So that's quali done and dusted, but let's talk about what Max Verstappen, who started on pole, described as a spicy sprint, Ben.
It was a good sprint race. I really enjoyed it, actually. He made a really good start off that pole position, and of course that makes such a big difference. Getting into the first turn, he was able to be ahead of both of the McLarens. But then the pressure he came from Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri was fantastic in the early stages of that race. I really enjoyed it. Lando getting past him at one point, thought he might have the lead, but then Oscar Piastri managed to nip past Lando and take the second place. By that point, Max was settling in and actually was able to pull away and go on to take yet another sprint win this year. He's taken all of them so far. So it did work well for him, but McLaren proved their ability.
So Verstappen winning it in first place, then Piastri in second ahead of Lando Norris. And then it was George Russell, Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton. Seventh place, Charles Leclerc. And final points paying position was Sergio Perez in eighth place. I loved the start of this race. For me, I take it in two halves. The first half was thrilling. The second half was a bit, I suppose, of a procession.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it went off so intensely when the battles at the beginning of the race were so hard that actually tyres began to overheat, and people had to start to manage the race in the second half, and that meant the gaps just started to open out. Max, once he broke the DRS over the McLarens, was able to kind of control it a little bit himself. So yeah, it was a game of two halves, you're absolutely right, but the first half was absolutely brilliant. If we get more of that tomorrow, I'm here for that. That's great.
I was quite impressed they all got through the first corner without more drama, actually, because quite often, and there were quite a few changes, weren't there? I mean, we saw Charles Leclerc, for example, who'd been down in 10th place. He made up a few places on the opening lap. And it does make me wonder for the Grand Prix come tomorrow, are they all going to get through that first corner as cleanly as they did today? Because it can be so crucial to the outlay of the race.
Yeah, and obviously there's been a big talking point, particularly off the back of Barcelona, about Lando's starts, which obviously wasn't great in Barcelona and arguably did cost him the race win. Today, again, it wasn't perfect. It was actually his teammate of the two McLarens. It was Piastri who actually had a slightly better start, and Verstappen a better start than both of them. So of course, with the sprint weekend, you get a second opportunity to have a go at that, to tweak some settings, to look through the data. And when we get to tomorrow's race, Lando Norris will be looking to maximise that launch off the line, because it's one of the best opportunities on this circuit to get past.
I mean, he described it as amateur, what he did out there. But it, to us, or to me anyway, and the casual fan, it didn't look amateur. It just looked like he just couldn't get it quite done right. So how could he have improved that? How could he have made it stick?
He's very hard on himself, isn't he, Lando Norris? We see it time and time again. He's very self-critical, and there's an element of that can be useful, because you start to analyse yourself and you pick up on any weaknesses and therefore have an opportunity to try and improve on them. But I think he's been overcritical on himself. I think he made a big lunge on Verstappen. He did take first place. The one thing you could argue that he didn't quite nail today was that when he went down after making the overtake and took the lead of the race, he kind of left the door open into turn 4, which allowed Max Verstappen to sort of repeat the effort and make a big lunge down the inside to get the place back. So that might be one area that he'll definitely look at and say, well, that's what I could do differently. But again, this is a test ahead of tomorrow's Grand Prix. So if they find themselves in similar positions in the race tomorrow, he's now got some experience. He knows where one of his vulnerabilities might be.
I thought one of the other aspects that I really enjoyed from the sprint race was the fact that the track limits was not a major problem, because they've redone the curbing on quite a few of the corners here. In the past, we've always thought, oh, is he going to get a penalty? Is this one going to get a penalty? And that always comes afterwards. We didn't get any of that today. It was lovely. They weren't running wide in places where they normally run wide, particularly the last two corners. They've reset the curbing there, and I think they've done a fantastic job of that.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, last year's Grand Prix here, it was 5 hours after the checkered flag fell before we actually got a confirmed result. 1,200 incidents being reviewed by race control. So they had to do something, and the solution they've put in place with this very thin strip of gravel just means there's no advantage to the drivers really pushing those limits anymore. So it's almost self-policing. So I think a good move. It's working. I'm
quite fascinated by the debrief from the sprint race, because obviously qualifying's happened as well, but how does the team work around Piastri and Norris and getting the best out of both of them and looking at both of their faults and where they could improve? Because those are two kind of almost separate conversations that need to happen privately, but then you have to have them all together as well in the debrief. Yeah, it is interesting actually, because actually today I think Norris was probably the quicker of the two McLarens, and yet after that little tussle with Verstappen, it opened a door for Piastri to get through, and probably Norris was then stuck behind him to some extent. The team will now know that, of course, but what they do have in their locker is that, Red Bull
don't have all the time. They don't have a Perez in the same battle as Verstappen, whereas the two McLarens are very close to each other. So in a longer race where you've got much more strategy at play, that becomes a real asset. So they might start to look to work together against a Red Bull team when they're chasing down what's actually a viable championship challenge.
I agree with that. There's a good possibility that Norris and Piastri can work together in a Grand Prix. I think in a sprint race it's very difficult. We don't have pit stops. You don't have other elements in a sprint race that you can really work together in quite the same way. But I do think in the Grand Prix where the pit stops are absolutely crucial, and of course the first one to make a pit stop is often the advantage anyway, but you can then use something that the other driver might not have that early pit stop, but you can use them in some other way to help benefit the overall result. So yeah, I agree, and I think the fact that Perez is not playing a part really at the moment. I mean, he finished down in 8th place with Max Verstappen winning that race. The gaps, Max is out there on his own for Red Bull. There's no doubt about it at the moment.
And that is a problem going forward, isn't it? Even though, I mean, we talk about this now that he's re-signed with Red Bull almost every week and every race time, but I just don't get it. I still just don't get it. I adore Sergio Perez. I really like him as a person. He obviously is a very good driver to have driven for all the different teams he has. He keeps coming round to be picked for Red Bull, but he's not as good as the drivers around him.
No, and I think even he'll be questioning that after this run of results with people like us constantly talking about it. But I think we know why Red Bull have signed him. I think, without beating around the bush, I think they've signed him at least in a large part to keep Max Verstappen happy. They don't want to upset the apple cart because Max Verstappen is literally Red Bull's biggest asset. In anything they do moving forward, they want to keep him happy. They want to keep him. There's already rumours and talk of Max Verstappen going elsewhere, possibly even as soon as next year. Red Bull can't allow that to happen. And the signing of Sergio Perez just is an attempt to try and make sure they keep that stable platform and keep the Verstappen camp happy.
Okay, guys, what did we learn from today that is going to help us with tomorrow and the action in the Grand Prix, Mark?
We learned just how good Max Verstappen is, unfortunately, under pressure when it matters. But that was over the one lap. I think in the sprint, it was clearly a lot closer. I know he won that as well. So it's difficult to make an argument, isn't it, against Max Verstappen dominating the weekend. I still think there's more to come. I've been saying this all weekend. I still think there's more to come from Lando Norris. And I genuinely think in the Grand Prix tomorrow, over the longer distances, with the strategy at play and with the sort of tyre management that Lando and McLaren are able to employ, or deploy rather, I think he's got an opportunity. So we'll see.
We will. I think it's going to be a tough one. The temperatures have been higher here this weekend than we kind of expected, and that could have an effect on all the cars going through the course of this longer Grand Prix and with pit stops coming in as well. So I think that could make a big difference. Yes, Verstappen's got the advantage. We've seen that this weekend in both qualifying and in that sprint race. But Lando Norris is in great form. He's still pushing hard. And the fact that George Russell is up there as well now, with Piastri having been pushed down, and that chance to get another podium, I think George is right on it and getting a bit more confident with the car. Lewis Hamilton will be a little frustrated, I think, with what happened today. So I think there is a lot to enjoy from this race. I agree that Max is probably going to be the favourite to win it, but it's not always possible. He was very clean. They were very tidy in the sprint race. I can imagine it might get a little bit harder in the main race as everybody tries to find a way past him.
Yeah, I think Verstappen has been well-mannered up until now. He hasn't felt that absolute pressure that he did back in 2021 with Hamilton. Yeah. But if that challenge starts to mount and Norris is repeatedly there and gaining confidence and gaining experience and bringing that challenge right up, could that prove a turning point in this championship and the way that kind of the course of history will go if you look at their friendship and how they are?
Well, only time will tell. But of course, that is Lando's only hope. He has to do that, and McLaren have to do that. And it's not just a battle between Lando and Max. It is the teams as well. Red Bull themselves are operating everything at such a high level, from pit stops to strategy to the way the car is designed and set up. And then, of course, Max does his thing behind the wheel. Lando and McLaren are kind of, as I said earlier, they're on this journey to that level. and they're right there or thereabouts. But to do that every single week, it's the tiniest margins, and that's what Red Bull have been so good at. We've got to congratulate them. You know, it's frustrating for a lot of fans at home. They're doing what every team is desperately trying to do. It's just they've done it better than everyone else.
They have, but I think what's wonderful about this year is they are not in the same dominant form as they were last year. Just remember last year, Sergio Perez started this race from 15th and finished 3rd. Do we really think he's going to get a podium from 8th, Perez, this time? I don't think so. Because Red Bull are actually not in the same position they were last year, and Max is having to, as you say, deliver his absolute best now. But that's what's fun to watch in a way, and he is under some proper threat from the others.
Really is fascinating. You've made me fast forward in my brain to Spa and penalties and engine penalties and all sorts of things, but I won't get too carried away. It's quali day. We've had the sprint race. It's been great, but the best, hopefully, is still to come. Join us tomorrow. The race gets underway at 2 p.m. Thank you to all the team. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.